Going down in a mini-submersible was not always known as a billionaire's folly. Real research is being conducted on a daily basis using the small, roving, independent submersible machines. But when things go wrong in these small subs, the consequences are catastrophic. This is the fatal breakdown of the Sea Link submersible tragedy. The Smithsonian Institute commissioned the building of an extraordinary submersible built for a team of 4. The Johnson Sea Link was used to perform many sea research functions, like sample collection and ecosystem monitoring. On this day, a team would be heading down to an artificial reef to collect a fish trap that they had placed the day before. This reef was established with the scuttling of a decommissioned Navy ship, the USS Barry. Scientists were interested in the sea life that had been established around it, and the trap would help monitor the various species of fish in the area. Dr. Robert Meek would be going down with the pilot, Jock Menzies, to collect this trap using the Sea Link's multi-use arm to grab it. Because it was just a quick trip down, 2 observers hopped in the back dive chamber of the Sea Link to observe the collection. Clayton Link and Smokey Stover would be in the dive chamber, but not planning on any external vehicle dives. The Sea Link was built with 2 separate chambers. The front section was an acrylic bubble, which allowed nearly 360-degree views undersea. This helped the pilot see the entire area around the structure while maneuvering into place. The back chamber was essentially a diving bell. This compartment could be pressurized to match the surrounding ocean water. Then the hatch could be opened to allow divers to exit the vehicle without flooding the chamber. Once a dive was complete, the divers would re-enter the chamber, lock the hatch, and then a slow decompression of the bell would take place on the ship to return to the normal sea level pressure of 1 atmosphere. Since this trip would only involve a quick collection, they were not expected to be gone long. The internal pressure of the Sea Link would remain at sea level, so decompression would not be necessary. At 8:36 a.m. on Father's Day, Sunday, June 17th, Jock piloted the Sea Link down to the seafloor for nearly the 100th time. In just 10 minutes, they had dropped 360 feet to the location of the ship wreckage. Dr. Robert Meek was looking around to locate the fish trap, while Jock carefully navigated around the reef to tuck into the area where the arm could reach the fish basket. Jock tried several times to bring in the fish trap with the arm of the Sea Link. Attempts were made from different angles to pierce the cage of the trap, but they failed to collect it. After 30 minutes, Jock abandoned the collection effort and decided to back out of the area to start the ascent. As the Sea Link carefully backed past metal railings, poles, and equipment of the rusty ship, the Sea Link was abruptly stopped with a jerk. Jock instantly used the thrusters to try to reverse the direction they were going. Several attempts forward and backward could not free the vehicle. Robert Meek and Jock were looking around the acrylic bubble to identify exactly what had them hung up. They asked Clayton and Smokey, 2 advanced divers, to look out their small portholes in the back to see if they could offer any additional information. Smokey Stover was a sub-pilot with decades of experience, and Clayton Link was the Smithsonian Director of Diving. Despite this highly experienced crew, a metal cable attached to the ship had snagged one of the protruding devices on their vehicle. Jock jumped on the phone to call up to the ship to let them know the situation. He had spent 15 minutes trying to free them, but was now sure that it would take some external help to cut the cable or otherwise release it manually. It was now 9:45 on Sunday morning, and they were trapped under 360 feet of seawater. The sea diver ship called on the Navy for assistance. They would need highly trained divers to head down in the complicated environment of a downed ship. The relatively small submersible was tucked in, with a huge ship all around it. The team on the ship, along with the 4 men on board, were calculating all the factors that might affect their safety. Chiefly among them was air to breathe. It looked like the 2 chambers had plenty of oxygen and carbon dioxide removal to keep the air safe for almost 2 days. Or so it seemed. Jock and Robert were in the front chamber, surrounded by a 5-inch thick acrylic bubble. They could barely see the 2 men in back, but could talk to them on an intercom system within the sub. Clayton and Smokey were in an aluminum cylinder about 8 feet long and 5 feet wide. They tried to make themselves comfortable, waiting for the Navy divers to arrive, both now regretting their wardrobe choice on this day. Thinking that it would be a quick trip down, they didn't bother changing out of their shorts and t-shirts. They were sitting in a metal tube in 45-degree water, and it was already starting to cool. The men talked about various topics to pass the time, and a slight anxiety floated in the air. Mostly they were left to their own thoughts, to preserve air quality and keep themselves calm. They were all experts and could easily think through a half a dozen options on how to get the vessel free. But for now, the best option was just to stay put and let others come down to assist. During all this downtime, the guys in front were rethinking some of their choices as well. When Jock was closing himself into the acrylic bubble, he was made aware that one of the fans in the front CO2 scrubber wasn't working. He felt like the air was fine and they wouldn't be down for long enough for CO2 to become an issue. As the hours passed, it started to become clear that carbon dioxide was very much an issue. The lack of a fan meant that he would have to open the canister of berylline, the substance that actually absorbed CO2 from the air. Normally, the fan would run the air through the canister and expel clean air on the other side. Jock took the canister of berylline and dumped it in a t-shirt, then held this pouch in front of the AC fan. This would give the berylline a chance to work and keep the air comfortable while they waited. The guys in the back were starting to really feel the cold. The aluminum hull had a high heat transfer coefficient, much higher than the 5-inch thick acrylic that surrounded the front compartment. After 6 hours of waiting, they were feeling anxious. Their breathing was getting heavier as their body temperatures started to drop. Clayton and Smokey knew that something else was wrong too. It felt like they were trying to breathe under the covers, with something pressed against their faces. The CO2 levels should have been good for at least another day, but they were already noticing a big change. Jock radioed up to the guys on the ship to have them recalculate the berylline effectiveness at lower temperatures. The men up on the ship were the best in the business. They were using the Navy's data tables and had the Sea Link's designer among them. He was desperate to figure out how far off their initial calculations were on the CO2 scrubber effectiveness. Edwin Link had spent years designing and building this sub, and it had completed 130 dives over the past few years without issue. As they finalized the new calculations, Edwin was stunned. The men in the diver's compartment would only have 15 hours of breathable air at that temperature. Edwin Link was desperate to get all 4 men to safety, but there was one in particular. Clayton Link, the Smithsonian Director of Diving, was his son. He had until the end of the day to save his son from a grisly death. The Navy rescue ship arrived at 4:15 Sunday afternoon. It took hours for the ship to position itself near the Sea Link and determine its exact location. They relied on a low-tech method of dropping down a light, then asking the Sea Link to tell them which direction to move the light to get closer. They finally sent down 2 hard hat divers at 10:45 p.m. to locate the sub and cut the metal cable that ensnared the vehicle. These 2 divers were tethered to their ship by air hoses, heated water, and communication cables, all wrapped up in an umbilical that limited their movements. There were railings, poles, and cables, all crisscrossing the path they were trying to cross. Even if they could get past one, they would risk snagging their own lifeline trying to get past the next obstacle. After an hour of trying to reach the Sea Link, the Navy divers were recalled to their ship to regroup. These Navy divers were supposed to be the savior for the men of the Sea Link. Now, the situation was quickly becoming deadly. The berylline was starting to exhaust its absorbance capabilities, and the men in the diving chamber were feeling the effects: increased breathing rates, confusion, anxiety, and headaches. Each breath felt shallow and claustrophobic, like they couldn't fully expand their chests. At 10:25 p.m., they moved to using face masks to directly breathe an oxygen-helium mixture and block out the carbon dioxide built up in the room. They knew that Navy divers were in the water, so they just needed to hang on for a little longer. Little did they know that the divers would never make it to the Sea Link. Clayton and Smokey were freezing. In just a thin t-shirt and pair of shorts, they were stuck in a metal box surrounded by 45-degree water. The men had sat hour after hour, waiting for rescue to arrive, while using up their last breathable air, shivering together while daydreaming about a hot cup of coffee. When they found out that the Navy divers had been recalled to their ship, it became crystal clear that they had to do something. They decided to increase the pressure in the dive compartment to try to force the temperature up in the chamber. Generally, increasing the pressure causes more air particles to collide, which generates heat. Maybe by the time it matched the depth they were at, 12 atmospheres, they would be warm enough to try an external dive themselves. The pressure was slowly rising, but the men were suffering. Jock and Robert could only watch through a small hole to see what was going on with the men. The temperature in the pilot's chamber was cooling, but was much more insulated. The small area filled with two men, surrounded by thick plastic, maintained a much warmer temperature. Their barrelime was still extracting the carbon dioxide from the air, but there was a limit to how long it could work. The revised estimate was that the pilot's chamber would become dangerous after a total of 30 hours, and they had already been in the sub for nearly 16. It was now midnight, and the pressure back in the dive chamber was at a full 12 atmospheres. This allowed the men to open the bottom hatch and consider an external dive. Sadly, it was clear that this would not work. They didn't have the proper dive gear, and the temperature of the water would render them useless in just a few moments, when they were already weak and struggling to stay conscious. Jock and Robert were in regular communication with the men through the intercom system, but they started to hear some strange sounds. Through a small hole, they could now see the men convulsing. Jock reported the situation to the ship at 1:12 a.m. Edwin Link was frantic. He felt completely helpless in the quest to save his son. The Navy divers had started a second attempt to reach the Sea Link once the ship had been repositioned. It was 1:30 a.m., and the currents were pulling the men so far off course they would have no chance to reach the vessel. As they were recalled to the ship for a second time, hopes for saving Clayton Link and Smokey Stover were fading. They didn't have the luxury of mourning the failure. They had to continue on to try to save the two men still very much alive. Jock and Robert were devastated. They were in a life-and-death struggle for survival, and just a few feet away, their friends were dead. Less than 24 hours before, they had all casually embarked on a quick sub-trip for a routine procedure, and now they were gone. The pilot's chamber had several more hours of good air to breathe before they too would suffer the same gruesome death. Several attempts were made to send down hard hat divers. A bell was sent down with 2 additional divers, and a rover was put in the water to get a better look. All of these attempts took massive preparation from various ships, but ultimately, all had failed. It was becoming desperate. They were at the 28-hour mark, and the barrelime was done. It was 12:40 on Monday afternoon, and they were now using their face masks to breathe the emergency air directly. This was the beginning of the end for these two men. When the emergency air ran out, they would be forced to breathe in the carbon dioxide that would certainly kill them too. Jock and Robert were trying to stay calm and use their resources wisely. They had been fighting the claustrophobia of this tiny ball for an entire day, breathing in air that felt like someone was covering their face with a towel. They sat quietly and thought, first trying to figure out how to get out of here, and then just thinking of their families and the fear of what was to come. The team up on the ship was regrouping. All their efforts had met with failure, and each time was a blow that seemed impossible to overcome. A salvage ship had now shown up with a submersible TV camera. It was mounted on a platform that they sent down to evaluate salvage sites. After a quick look with their submersible camera, an idea was hatched. They connected a grapnel hook to the camera and sent it back down. If they could hook any stable part of the Sea Link, it could be winched back up to the surface. It was a risky idea, but they were out of options, and these men were going to die within the next few hours. Despite the rigged-up rescue equipment, this crazy plan actually worked. The camera frame was maneuvered to the Sea Link, and they were able to hook the grapnel to the frame. In only a few minutes, the Sea Link was hoisted to the surface where Jock and Robert were removed from the acrylic pilot's bubble and put directly into a decompression chamber. Despite their brush with certain death, the men were medically cleared after just a few hours. After a 12-hour decompression of the dive chamber, Clayton Link and Smokey Stover were removed from the sub and transported to the hospital. They were officially pronounced dead, and their autopsies would later confirm that they both died of respiratory acidosis due to carbon dioxide poisoning. The incident was heavily investigated, and many changes were advised for future submersibles and rescue procedures. Edwin Link redesigned the Sea Link, and a new version was in use for many years after this incident. The loss of these men changed many safety standards for submersible recovery, Navy rescue procedures, and design elements for roving vehicles.